This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome. My name is Barry Colfer. I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute of International and European Affairs. Very warm welcome to the Institute for those joining in person, and hello to those joining online. I hope everyone had a nice long weekend. What better way to blow the cobwebs off than a discussion on trade and geopolitics, trade policy as a driver for EU competitiveness and resilience in a turbulent era. Obviously, a really important topic, but also just to acknowledge in advance of the Irish presidency of the Council of the EU, which is forthcoming, both competitiveness and resilience are likely to feature most prominently in Ireland's presidency priorities, which will be published in June. Olof Gill is joining us. Olof is Deputy Chief Spokesperson at the European Commission and Spokesperson for Trade, Economic Security and Customs at DG Trade. Have I gotten that right? Olof is also from Mayo, and you'd know that if you ever spoke to him. Olof has spent about 20 years before his current role working in and around Irish politics and public life. Olaf's been a journalist. He's worked in various roles in Irish politics before taking on his current role. And he's going to address some of the issues pertaining to Europe's place in the world as a trade actor, as mentioned. I don't think he requires any further introduction from me, but just to acknowledge a couple of things. This event takes place in the auspices of our Future Proofing Europe programme, which is sponsored by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's really appreciated. Without the support of the department, we'd really struggled to do our work, so it's greatly appreciated. Just to acknowledge, this event is fully on the record. There will be an opportunity for Q&A. Those of you in the room, once Olof finishes his remarks, you can just raise your hand and a mic will come to you. And those joining us online, as ever, you can contribute questions or comments using the chat function on Zoom. So Olof, a really warm welcome back to the Institute. Thanks for being with us, and the podium is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Before I say what I want to say, I want to offer a special word of thanks to Barry for inviting me today, and I want to offer an even deeper and wider word of thanks to the IIEA for the work that they do. A few weeks ago, maybe it was last week, I lose track, the Prime Minister designate of Hungary, Peter Magyar, came to Brussels to meet President von der Leyen. And among the many topics discussed was the fact that civil society in Hungary has been corroded to a very substantial degree over many years, and democracy thus weakened. And we take the work of organizations like the IIEA, meaning work that is fact-based and geared towards critical analysis and bringing people together. We take that for granted at our peril. So thank you, Barry. Thank you to the Institute. And I'm sure you're looking forward to a busy and productive Irish presidency. Barry asked me to speak about trade in particular, which is the topic I know best, but also where trade fits within the wider spectrum of priorities for the European Commission doing its work on behalf of the European Union at the moment. And the short way to describe it is that the focus of this mandate under President von der Leyen is building Europe's independence. Independence meaning the capacity to make our own decisions economically, diplomatically, geopolitically, and to the largest extent possible have our own autonomous tools with which to strengthen our own present and build a prosperous and safe future for our citizens. The focus on competitiveness, which I think it's fair to say supersedes everything else at the present time, derives from the fact that in a more volatile world, in a contested geopolitical reality, in a political and diplomatic environment in which old certainties can no longer be relied upon, Europe's geopolitical strength, our diplomatic strength, our ability to shape and influence world affairs, essentially, derives largely from our economic strength. Our comparative economic strength is diminishing vis-a-vis other global powers, other global regions, and therefore there is now a laser focus, I think is the fair way to describe it, on giving ourselves every chance to remain competitive in the coming years, in the coming decades, because everything else we hope to achieve at the global level, most of which I still think is, it's fair to say, rooted in our values, our universalism, we need to remain competitive in order to achieve those things. So the roadmaps for that competitiveness agenda are the Draghi and Letta reports, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And I think you have seen, since those reports were published, a very substantial effort invested into translating their very logical and I think very sensible suggestions into real proposals with defined timelines. That latter aspect is very important because traditionally we weren't maybe as ruthless as we should have been about imposing defined timelines on what we want to achieve and by when. And you'll see, just to give one example, the recent, I always get the name of it wrong, One Europe, One Market strategy, which I think was just published a couple of weeks ago. The timelines for what needs to be completed by when are very clearly spelled out. And fortuitously, many of them have a timeline end 2026. What that means is that the Irish presidency of the European Union is going to have a real, palpable influence over the success or otherwise of the competitiveness agenda from which all other agendas flow. So, getting back to the trade aspect, our trade agenda is one of the pillars of our competitiveness agenda. Our trade agenda is one of the pillars of our quest for European strategic independence. That concept might seem counterintuitive because trade is all about building relationships with partners around the world, and the concept of independence is more geared towards what you can do at home, strengthening your indigenous capacities for industry, for energy, and even looking at possible treaty change to improve decision-making and so on. Whereas trade relationships by their nature are global. You're talking about the buying and selling of goods, rules-based platforms for working together on other issues, global challenges, climate change, the global institutional framework, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that trade relationships boost the push for European strategic independence because, on the one hand, they provide vital new commercial opportunities. And if you take the trade deals that were concluded, the trade deals for which political talks were concluded recently, here I'm talking about Mercosur, India, and Australia in that order, the potential commercial impact, the potential GDP gain is very substantial. as well as that, it can't be forgotten that Europe is a comparatively resource-poor continent. We rely on imports for consumer choice. We rely on imports for the inputs we need for our drive towards competitiveness. Here I'm notably thinking about critical raw materials so that we can build the clean tech sectors we so ardently want to construct here at home in order to no longer be relying on other global powers, one in particular. I'm talking also about the inputs we need to keep our world-beating agri-food sector strong, competitive, dynamic, and trade partnerships offer us a reliable two-way flow of goods and services, commercial opportunities to strengthen our economic base at home, and imports that we need to strengthen that economic base even further. I mentioned the three colossal trade deals that were delivered at the start of 2026. It's not by accident that these that this kind of glut of trade deals has happened in so short a space of time. It's precisely because the European mindset, Jarka, this great word in Irish, outlook, the European outlook that cooperation still matters, that collaboration can still deliver results over coercion, that rules-based partnerships still have a value in the time where rules are increasingly ignored by big powers. In all that space, partners around the world are lining up to do deals with Europe. So I've mentioned the three from the start of the year. We expect that Mexico will happen in the coming weeks. President von der Leyen travels to Mexico on the 20th of May, I think, 21st maybe, for an EU Mexico summit. We are gearing up for a summit with the UK, possibly in June. It could spill into July, which would be great in a way because, again, the Irish presidency could get its fingerprints on it and really steer it towards meaningful outcomes. It's from a pure statistical perspective, the UK is one of the European Union's most important trading partners. That's sometimes forgotten amid the noise. And on that basis, it should be and is being prioritized as one of our trade agenda priorities at the present time. Looking around the world then, I think we are hopeful that we can achieve some sort of an agreement with the Philippines, kind of September time. As well as that, the most important commercial relationship in the world, namely that between the European Union and the United States, continues to be a priority. What is currently happening, if I can give a brief summary from both sides. On the US side, they have made a commitment that in spite of the road bump of their own Supreme Court declaring the legal base for their tariff regime to be illegal, that they will honor the commitments made in the EU-US joint statement from last year, that the tariff ceiling they committed to will be respected, and that on that basis, we will have a solid platform from which to look at new areas for tariff reduction, look at areas we still need to figure out how to copper fasten our cooperation, notably on steel and steel derivatives. So the US is currently operating a kind of interim tariff regime until it clarifies what, and this interim regime by law can't be in place any longer than I think mid-July, early July. So before then, the US has to clarify what the new legal base for their tariff regime will be, how that will impact on the European Union, how within that they will honor their commitments, and from there, and hopefully under the Irish presidency, we'll have great opportunities to look at other areas for tariff reductions, more structured cooperation, etc. On the EU side, we made a commitment last year that we would eliminate, meaning reduce to zero, European Union tariffs on imports of American industrial goods, all American industrial goods. The process for implementation of that commitment is ongoing. It is following the normal, standard legislative workflow. The wheels are turning. They may not be turning at the speed some people would like, but that's how fast they turn here. We're very close to finalizing the interinstitutional negotiations for what precisely our structures will be around our commitments. One introductory trilogue between the Commission, Council and Parliament has taken place. That was really just a formality. The serious work in the last two trilogues will take place in May and June. And we have every expectation that by the third trilogue in June, the negotiations will have developed to the point that we can deliver fully on our commitments and thus move serenely forward in our trade and investment relations with the US. One last point I think it's important to mention, China. So much has happened in Q1 2026 in terms of large-scale geopolitical shocks. Thinking notably of the war in Iran and its very serious impact on global supply chains for energy, fertilizer, and other crucial products for our economies. There is an overdue reflection on how EU-China relations should evolve. There is an overdue reflection on that. It is happening. It isn't happening as fast as we would have liked. There was to be a formal orientation debate with the full College of European Commissioners in April. That was postponed due to the need to have a college orientation debate on the energy crisis. I think that was both appropriate and timely. That orientation debate on China will now take place at the end of May. And I expect that that will be a very dynamic discussion in which the next steps from the European Union perspective will be fleshed out in terms of how we can, on the one hand, create possibly different or stronger cooperation structures with China to achieve the necessary, as we view it, rebalancing and reciprocity from our trade and investment relationship. On the other hand, I do think there will be a very serious look at additional trade defense tools that may be required in order to achieve that same goal of rebalancing and greater reciprocity. Barry, I think I'll stop there. I think there's plenty of meat there that I can offer you all. And I find these types of interactions to be best when there's a bit of engagement. So I'm happy to open the floor for questions from our wonderful host or from any of you as well. Thanks very much.
You can stay there if you like, or you can take a seat, Olof. It's as you wish. I thought when you were talking about, you were teeing us up to say the most important trade relationship in the world is between the EU and the EU. I thought you were going to say, just in terms of
The what?
the EU and the EU on itself.
Yeah.
Listen, Olof hinted at it there. We have a really interesting bunch of people here in person, from pharma, tech, energy, ag, embassies, civil service, EU institutions, research. That's just the people I recognize. So I think there's an enormous amount of expertise here. I'll be turning to you very soon. I'm going to indulge myself, Olof, with one or two questions. Just to let you know, I'm left thinking about trade agreements. I want to ask about European, Mercosur, and our relations with the US. I won't get to all of them myself, but that's what you've left me thinking about. Just to open with a broad one. Is there anything to be said for some of the recent agreements you've mentioned, India, Australia? They've sometimes been criticized for lacking depth. And is there something to be said for now in the current milieu, the current kind of trading environment we're in, that we have to settle for that in order to get stuff across the line and agreements need to be less comprehensive, or can we still be as ambitious as in the past?
Okay, fair question. I don't agree with the characterization that those recent trade agreements lack depth. I mean, they're very, very substantial, comprehensive trade agreements. If anything, you can make a case that they go too far beyond the core purpose of trade, which is to buy and sell goods and services. If you look at the Mercosur agreement, there's a phenomenally sort of deep trade and sustainable development chapter. There are all sorts of commitments around respect for the Paris Climate Agreement, tackling deforestation, promoting labor rights, promoting gender equality, notably within the trade space. So, hardcore trade aficionados would tell you that, can we just focus on the buying and selling, please? But that's very much the EU approach, that we try to absolutely retain the core value of trade agreements, which is to buy and sell goods and services, and in so doing, bind us closer in a political and diplomatic way to important partners around the world. But equally, we do still orient ourselves towards using trade agreements, using these privileged rules-based partnerships to try to promote EU values around the world and to encourage our partners to see the merit in so doing. A second point of reflection around that idea of deep or less deep forms of trade cooperation is that, in fact, that's precisely what we are doing at the present time. So, yes, we have these classical heavy-duty 1,000-page trade agreements where almost every aspect of bilateral cooperation is tackled. But we're also trying to be more agile in putting in place thinner forms of agreement, notably with a number of African countries, what we call economic partnership agreements. We've signed a number of those in recent times, and we're aiming to get one over the line with the ESA 5, as they call themselves, during the summer. We also have signed, I think at last count, 16 forms of cooperation on critical raw materials, most recently with the United States, in fact, which was a very welcome reminder that it isn't actually that difficult for the EU and US to find avenues of positive cooperation, particularly when it comes down to brass tacks. We share the same worldview about sourcing of critical raw materials, the need to have reliable and stable supply chains around them in order that they can't be weaponized by other global players. So I think what you see is the EU on the one hand, holding the line as regards the deep and comprehensive trade agreements, because ultimately they're the ones that, deliver the widest range of very tangible benefits. But you also see a spectrum now of narrower, thinner forms of cooperation around investment, around sustainable investment, around critical raw materials, and so on. And I think that's the right way to go, because every type of agreement you sign with someone binds you closer together. And if we take the Mercosur agreement, which is, it's kind of exceptional in many ways, and we can get into it if you want, but it took 25 years to get it over the line. With some of the issues I mentioned, notably around critical raw materials, we can't be waiting 25 years. So it's appropriate to have different forms of structure at different times.
And in these kind of thinner cooperation agreements, can the EU still expect to exert its values and its expectations around human rights, the environment, labor code, and such, as we would have done in the past?
Well, this is the thing, and this is why I think the EU's offer is so valuable. We don't expect. We put something on the table, and we say, here's what we can deliver. So the approach, let's take an example of Africa. The approach of other global powers towards Africa is a purely transactional one, as in, we give you money, you give us resources. We build your port, you give us access to your port for 100 years. That works up to a point. The European Union's offer is, here is a set of rules through which we will cooperate. By committing to building more sustainable supply chains around critical raw materials or industrial development or clean energy or whatever, not alone will you potentially stand to gain enormously in terms of infrastructural development and economic development, but by putting those structures in place, European investment will flow. And therefore you have these kind of, proper partnerships where both sides derive benefit in the long term from the ground up. I know this sounds very flowery and rhetorical, but that is the value of the EU offer, and we believe, and I think the evidence shows that is particularly valued in a time when other things are much less certain.
Excellent. That's well prosecuted, I think. I'm going to indulge myself with one more, and then I'm coming to the group here for contributions, questions, comments. In light of the title of your remarks included resilience in a turbulent era. Don't need to go over the details of that. I think everyone understands the turbulence, the geopolitical moment we're living in. If you take things like Buy European, Made in Europe, strategic autonomy itself, is the EU inevitably becoming more protectionist when it comes to trade, and is it okay?
I often refer to the French perspective on these issues. France was talking about the geostrategic imperative of European strategic autonomy 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It was not very fashionable at the time, and often France was quite isolated in that position. Now that position has been mainstreamed. And I think if you look at the genesis of that French perspective, it derived from the understanding that without a strong indigenous industrial base, all the other ambitious targets and lofty goals won't be possible, because Europe's geopolitical strength, to a very large extent, derives from its economic strength. And so I think what you see now is a rebalancing of priorities between giving additional flexibility and support and structured help, if you like, to European industry, European companies, European farmers, to maintain and grow our industrial and economic strength. What we're trying to do is strike a balance between some degree of support structures that don't weaken our overall outlook, which remains globally oriented, a very open single market in which we welcome competition, in which we welcome investment, provided it is fair and provided it is not jeopardizing those same goals of helping our industrial champions at home. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, there is a much stronger focus on how we can help our companies of all sizes here in Europe to be built, to scale, to grow and create jobs, to become ideally global champions without isolating ourselves needlessly.
Thanks very much, Olaf. Now, to those of you who joined us here, would anyone like to ask anything of Olaf or indeed say anything? Okay, I see a bunch of hands. I'm going to start with this gentleman here. I'll come to you, Seamus, but then Jim. We're going to take questions in pairs. Is that okay?
Sure.
If you could just identify yourself for Olaf, please, it'd be appreciated.
Thanks, Olaf. Ray Leiden, Central Bank. China, it's like every other week we get a seminar in the Euro system on China, and firms squealing about not just final goods, but intermediate goods. All this, the Commission is really good to have macro dashboards for tracking all of this. But going back to your overdue reflection, do you have particular sectors in mind, and on the tools, particular tools in mind?
Thanks. I will take a question from Jim McGrath from IFA as well. Thanks very much, Mr. Lyons.
Thanks a million. Jim McGrath from the Irish Pharmaceutical Healthcare Association. Just a question on how the Commission is approaching trade discussions with the White House, in particular, when the grievance or perceived sin in the view of the White House in an area of European policy, the competence lies with the member state and not with the Commission. And I'm thinking pharma and tech regulation in particular, and the challenge that presents for the Commission and Europe more generally. Thank you, Olaf.
Okay. Try those two on for size when you can.
Thanks for those very, very interesting questions. On the China reflection, I mean, in an on-the-record public event, I can't say too much, but I mean, the parameters of the problem are very well known and have been repeatedly flagged at the highest levels by leaders of the European Union. There was an EU-China summit last July. If you look back at the language from the European political principles there, I mean, it's pretty clear, we're talking about the ongoing challenges in the, first of all, that European companies increasingly face in China, the deterioration of the market certainty they face there. And if you look at any of the reports by the European Chamber of Commerce in China, the outlook is bleaker and bleaker. But as well as that, the big piece, of course, is the fact that the Chinese economic and industrial strategy is geared towards creating global industrial champions through heavy state subsidization, through various other forms of state intervention that are, by any metric, go against their global obligations as World Trade Organization members, notably. So we've been very transparent and explicit in portraying the parameters of the problem. Where we see a difficulty is the lag between what Chinese political principles say, meaning they often express a willingness to address these challenges in our bilateral engagement with them. That does not, in any meaningful way, has not, at least in recent times, translated into anything resembling real policy action. So I do believe that the upcoming orientation debate will clarify the perspectives on how we will address the problems I've mentioned. I think there is a willingness to adopt a positive approach wherein you could create potentially new cooperation structures to try and move these issues forward. But I also think, it's not a secret, the work is already happening internally at the Commission to think about what additional trade defense tools we might need to have on the table to offer a legitimate defense of our industrial interests, our economic interests and trade interests. It's very striking that in recent times we discussed the Industrial Accelerator Act, which contains this Made in Europe initiative, and it is objectively true that policy is geared towards giving targeted support to European industrial development. And some of the public utterances, notably from MOFCOM, the Chinese Commerce Ministry, on this have been very strong in saying, these types of protectionistic initiatives by the European Union will not be taken lightly by China, and if we have to respond, we have to respond. I mean, seriously, So that to me indicates that the direction of travel is good, and I do think the overdue orientation debate will be very important and very interesting. To Jim's question on how the EU approaches discussions with the US, given the sort of differences between what competences lie at European level and member state level, I think the classical sort of like the classical approach of other powers in dealing with the EU or in trying to gain leverage with the EU is divide and conquer. So, hit target member states, try to draw them out in order that the overall coherence or unity of the European Union is diminished. And that's, that's across the board. But if we take the most recent example, the threat by President Trump to impose higher tariffs than agreed under our joint EU-US joint statement on exports of European cars to the US, you will note that there has been few, if not no, public utterances by European leaders on this topic, even though it carries a substantial amount of economic risk for several European economies. All, if you count the downstream sectors that service the auto industry. And that is because in dealing with this American administration, I think European leaders, with one or two exceptions, one glaring exception, which is no longer on the pitch, thankfully, they get that our strength here is working together. And so, of course, Jim, there will be challenges, notably for Ireland, in the areas you mentioned, pharma and tech. Of course, Ireland's exposure to the US economy in these sectors is massive. Everyone knows that. It's not a secret. That's fully understood at the highest levels in Brussels, I would say. It's just a question of managing it as coherently as possible. And so far, at least, I think this is just my view, but I think the approach taken by European institutional leaders, by European member state leaders, has been the right one. And I hope that continues.
Thanks a million, Olaf. I've noticed one question here from John McGrain and John Fitzgerald at the back. I will get you, Seamus, don't worry. So go to John McGrain and John Fitzgerald, please.
Good morning, Olof. John McGrain from the Swedish Chamber of Commerce in Ireland. Bringing it closer to home and thinking about your own JARCA for the Irish presidency, there's a kind of an odd narrative has been spinning around for the last few weeks that's basically on the lines that, well, you know, EU presidencies ain't what they used to be anymore, and that, you know, there's an extraction of power from what they used to be back to, you know, a deep center of some sort. But could you just spend a couple of minutes helping us with your thoughts on our own actual upcoming presidency, and specifically around things like what's the agenda that needs doing by a presidency at this time, and what's the work that our ministers and expert civil servants have to bite into to make a success of whatever that prescription is between now and the end of the year.
Good question. Thanks, John. As the mic is working its way over to other John, I'll just remind everybody at home that you're very welcome to contribute questions as well.
John Fitzgerald, Trinity College. 2 questions. You talked about the need to develop European champions faced with what's happening in China. Intel built a plant completed a few years ago for $19 billion in Ireland, and that was paid for by Intel. And before it was completed, it was agreed that the German government could provide a subsidy of 10 billion euros for a 30 billion plant in Brandenburg, because Europe needed shipbuilding capacity. Now, that's not going ahead. But if the development of European champions is funded by national governments, big governments, it runs totally against the EU ideal that Sweden could not have afforded to put up the 10 billion subsidy for that plant, nor could Slovenia. So my concern is, in developing European champions, does that break up the single market? My second question is, it's very interesting what you talked about, these network of new trade agreements being agreed. At some stage, should Europe take the initiative in trying to reinvent the WTO from a business point of view, having different rules on engagement with Mercosur, with Canada, with India, with Australia? Would it not be better to try and redevelop among the coalition of the willing a network agreement like the WTO?
Thanks a million, John. 3 questions, Olaf.
Sure. Thank you to the 2 Johns for those great questions. So to John McGrain on the Irish presidency, I think I mentioned it, but I really think the core job of work is going to be completing the proposals that are scheduled to be completed before the end of this year. Those are ambitious timelines, and we all know that timelines often slip in the European Union. But I think that will be the real added value Ireland can bring to crack the whip. To, you know, traditionally Ireland is strong, and Irish presidencies are strong at doing the kind of the sort of above ground and below ground outreach that's required to move things forward, to invest the extra effort in dealing with the outliers or the intransigent countries, and to just really to kind of catalyze the discussions to the point that they're really getting somewhere. I mentioned the One Europe, One Market roadmap. I think it's worth repeating. The lion's share of the initiatives the goal is to complete them by N26. So that means Ireland is holding the tiller. And that's really a massive opportunity. And, you know, it doesn't require any kind of spectacular outside the box thinking or kind of grand plan. It just requires getting the plan that's there over the line. And maybe that is how a presidency, you know, you could, it's a kind of a debate as to whether, it's a fair question as to whether presidencies have the clout and the, you know, the kind of the force that they had in the past. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that by taking an approach of not reinventing the wheel, but simply getting the wheel that's there to turn faster, Ireland could do a great job. And I'm knowing what I know, I'm optimistic that can happen and that great results can be delivered. To John Fitzgerald, the lacune, as the French say, the gap, the kind of the parameters of what you're describing in terms of how can we develop and to some extent offer support to European champions that goes beyond the core principles of the European single market. I think it's a question of judicious balancing. I mean, I'm sure you've read the Draghi report. I mean, you know, the blueprint for completion of the single market, or at least for strengthening of the single market in terms of what it's supposed to do, is very clear. And I always like to come back to this statistic about if we were to successfully remove all the known obstacles and barriers to trade within the single market, it would generate as much and probably more economic impact as all these fantastic trade deals that I'm selling on a day-to-day basis. But you are quite correct that some of the structures we're proposing to put in place to give some degree of preferential treatment to European companies can potentially weaken the drive to complete the single market. So I think it's simply a balancing act. And from my read of the situation, having gone through most of the detail of the Industrial Accelerator Act and the Made in Europe clauses and so on, I mean, they're not that onerous, you know. I mean, they certainly are a new departure for the EU in terms of a slightly more inward-looking prioritization, but I don't think they fundamentally contradict the wider push to complete the single market. And your second question on the World Trade Organization, yes, absolutely. In a perfect world, the European Union would be the shining light towards building a global rules base that all major players, US, China, ASEAN, Mercosur, African Union, buy into, pay into, and whose tenets and structures they respect. That's not the reality we live in. And therefore, while the work the EU invests in trying to reform the global rules base, it remains substantial. And if you look back at the recent WTO ministerial in Yaoundé, Cameroon, you'll see that you know, the European Union really was trying, sometimes in vain, to move some of the core questions forward. So while we continue that work, in the absence of a global rules base, we do continue to pursue strong bilateral trade deals. We also try to pursue so-called plurilateral initiatives, meaning clusters of countries choosing to work together to have meaningful ways to work together in a range of areas. So we have a plurilateral initiative on the multi-party interim arrangement, MPIA, which is basically like an alternative decision-making structure in which countries can come together to try and have, a functioning rules-based and adjudication mechanism in the absence of such a multilateral structure at the WTO. Similarly, I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, but we are working very closely with a number of global partners to strengthen cooperation around sourcing, refining, and constructing sustainable supply chains around critical raw materials. Most recently with the US, which I view as a very positive development, and it also sends a very important signal that in spite of some of the other stuff that's going on, the EU and US actually can and do cooperate in a range of mutually relevant areas. So that cooperation structure we put in place with the US is also going to capture Japan and is open to others in order that it could become a plurilateral initiative. So yes, we would like there to be a functioning WTO. Yes, we are pushing for it. In its absence, we have to have different structures in place. One does not contradict the other.
Thanks a million, Olof. We're at the stage of the last volley of questions now. I see at least two. There's Peter Power from the Commission rep, and there's Seamus, who's waited very patiently for my team here. Anyone else wants to come in? Then I'll throw you a third one. Peter.
Presentation. Just on the question of the presidency, I mean, there are a number of ways in which a presidency can be judged as a success. There are the logistics, if the cars turn up on time, does the interpretation work? That's one aspect. But the other is down to luck, and in terms of timing of events, what actually happens during your presidency that requires a response. And the other measure is bringing Europe closer to people, bringing Brussels closer to people of Ireland, explaining to people what the institutions are about, what Europe is about. That sense of isolation that people normally feel is reduced somewhat. And the government, I think, have been fantastically successful in terms of reaching out to stakeholders and people to actually define the priorities of the presidency. So I think the explanation of Europe to people is probably the most important aspect of the presidency. It's not something that we would normally turn our minds to accept at a moment during the presidency.
Thanks a million, Peter. Then Seamus, and I should say as well, Seamus pulled everything together for this event. So thank you, Seamus.
Thank you, Seamus.
Seamus Allen, a senior researcher here at the IA. Thank you so much for your really interesting address. So two quick questions. Just the first one on this new departure in European preferencing that you mentioned. Can you comment on the perspectives of Europe's partners on it, or has there been much feedback so far? And I'm just thinking, do they perceive it as being protectionist? And is there a risk when Europe's credibility is so important? And certainly many European countries criticize other countries for so-called unfair trade practices. But is there a risk some of these European measures seem quite similar? And the second question is just about relations with the US. So last year, twice, when an agreement was made or nearly made with the US, suddenly the president came out and threatened new trade tariffs on the EU if we didn't roll back certain regulations. On another occasion, threatened tariffs if we didn't change our trading relationship with India and with China. Can you just comment, is there a perception in the Commission that there's actually a risk of agreeing too much or compromising too much in a way that could embolden further demands that might actually take away from our ability to trade with others? Thank you so much.
Thanks a million, Seamus. I'm going to squeeze a tiny one in, really kind of test your memory, Olof. I think you mentioned there's going to be the EU-UK summit in June, maybe July, might take place during the course of the Irish presidency. We have colleagues here from the British Embassy. We're entering a period of potential instability, again, in the UK's domestic politics. Are there any big objectives that you would see in terms of trade from the EU-UK summit forthcoming?
Okay, thanks. So loads of good questions there. So start with Ambassador Power's comments and questions around the Irish presidency. I think everything you said is totally correct. Logistics is key. And I've no doubt that Ireland will rise to that challenge. Luck, yeah, that goes a long way too. But if I just take one example, because I've been thinking a bit about this. So the European political community, the EPC, this President Macron-led initiative to have a wider European cooperation structure, reflection structure around, security, geopolitics, and so on. The most recent meeting of the EPC took place just yesterday. It's ongoing, but our European Commission President participated yesterday in Yerevan, Armenia, and there was a bilateral meeting between President von der Leyen and PM Starmer. Very positive, very good signaling in terms of cooperation in the geopolitical and sort of security and defense space. The next EPC takes place in Dublin in November. And there was a really excellent segment on it on RT News last night. And I think it's great that, because, one of the pleasures of my job is that I get to observe and understand how news is consumed in different countries. There does tend to be an awful lot in Irish news about the sun came out today, or, quintuplet lambs were born in County Armagh. The fact that we are talking in May about the importance of the European political community, the importance of Ireland holding the next meeting, and already now offering some analytical reflection on the importance of that, I think that speaks volumes, and I think that says a lot about how focused the Irish mindset is right now, and that can only be a good thing. But take that EPC meeting in Ireland in November. Ireland's a neutral country, and there's been a fair amount, I think, of angsting about how Ireland, as a neutral country, can credibly and meaningfully move the debates forward in what is now one of the most important priority discussions in the European Union, for very obvious reasons, around security, defense, around interoperability, about counter-drone measures, all this kind of stuff. So I view this as a really, if you flip that around, it's a fantastic opportunity, because Ireland, as a country that doesn't have the kind of the traditional military perspective on these questions, will have a chance to talk and steer the discussion in the macro sense around what Europe needs to be doing, what the next steps should be in the development of these new instruments for defense procurement, for interoperability, for the Eastern Flank Watch, the Arctic security strategy, and maybe at some point we start talking about the Western Flank. As well as that, the fact that the EPC structure, but the security and defense space in general, is such a valuable component of the more positive EU-UK relationship at the moment. There's all sorts of upside and opportunity for Ireland in just that one EPC meeting happening here in November, to show that a small country that nonetheless has an important strategic geographical positioning as well as a geopolitical positioning can, even in the absence of being a member of NATO or whatever, can steer these discussions in a mature and focused way for the European Union as a whole, but also in drawing us closer to the UK, or drawing the UK closer to us is probably a better way to describe it, at a time when that is absolutely necessary. So there are great opportunities there, and I think Ireland will rise to the challenge as always. I agree with you fully, Ambassador Power, that a critical component of any presidency should be bringing Brussels closer to the people living in the presidency country. And the organization you head, the Commission representation, will have a phenomenally important role in that respect. And I think that would be a great opportunity, and I'm sure that will play out in a very positive sense. Seamus. European preferencing, do our trade partners criticize it? Are they considered to be unfair trade practices? Those are not easy questions to answer. But I would say that what characterizes the EU approach is that we very diligently engage with our partners in the pre, during, and post phases of policy formulation around Industrial Accelerator Act, Made in Europe, European preferencing, whatever it might be. So already there, because we are quite transparent and hands-on in our engagement, I think that you will see, a higher degree of recognition than you would for other global powers or countries that simply impose. I think that's a very valuable thing. Are they unfair trade practices? Some of the measures we're proposing, I don't believe they are. Even now, we invest massive effort and many hours from lawyers within the EU superstructure to make sure that everything is within the broad frame of our World Trade Organization obligations, and so on. So I think we're still golden in that sense. And on your question regarding the US administration and the threats that have arisen at various times, I mean, I think I referenced it earlier on that it was understood that it is the oldest cliche of all, that the European Union is more effective when it operates as a bloc. But I think in this particular situation, that has proven to be our great strength. And there are frequent threats. We're trying to deal with the reality, as in, how does any threat translate into something concrete? At what point do we need to engage? At what point do we need to push back? And so far, that has worked quite well. And I think that will continue to be the case. Last point, Barry, on the EU-UK summit. I mean, I'm not going to say anything particularly original on this. It's known what the priority questions for the European Union are. We want forward movement on youth mobility. We want forward movement on SPS. We want to, make trade and general economic cooperation as seamless as possible. We understand the political constraints that any UK government has to operate within, and we respect that. But the undeniable economic logic says that the closer we draw together, the more both sides benefit. And that certainly is the spirit in which we will approach the upcoming EU-UK summit.
Thanks, Olaf. Good point on which to end. So trade is fraught. It is phenomenally wide-ranging, as you've presented. There's loads happening. It's hard, it's abstract, but it's really critical. And I think you've presented very well how the EU seeks to present itself as a predictable, reliable, rules-based body. It's not the sexiest, it's kind of as a global partner. But amid what is hopefully this hiatus in the rules-based order, I think it's really excellent and I think warranted. To quote you, the EU is proceeding serenely, trying to answer questions of judicious balancing. And I think you've really kind of drawn together for me, if you think back to the 50s, the architects, like the beginning of the project, this idea that economic activity and fair, sustainable trade is one of the things that would make Europe prosperous and would maintain social cohesion. And I think you've represented that really well to us today, and you've answered a whole wide range of questions. So thanks a million. And if you could just thank Olof in the traditional way, please.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.